Some of the most important assumptions you're going to make in your retirement planning are your spending assumptions. And that, my friend, is what we're going to talk about today on the Retirement Answer Man Show. My name is Roger Whitney. I am your host, and this is the show dedicated to helping you not just survive retirement. We truly believe you can rock retirement, especially if you are wise in the assumptions you make in retirement. So this is week 2 of a series on retirement assumptions. And today we're going to dive into your spending assumptions, which can be critical. Spending in retirement is probably one of the biggest levers you have to have a great retirement from a financial perspective. In addition to that, we're going to answer some of your listener questions. But before we do any of that, I want to get to some interesting news that may present you an opportunity. Just the other day, I read an article by Jason Aten, A-T-E-N, a tech columnist at Inc. magazine. And he talks about a study that IBM did on American views and how they're changing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And according to this survey by IBM, 54% of Americans want to keep remote work as their primary mode of working. People are digging working at home, evidently. 70% say they'd like it to be at least an option. So remote work has been a trend in industry for a while, and it's had its fits and starts in terms of companies becoming comfortable with workers working remotely. And usually when there are trends like this, major events can happen that will accelerate trends. Learning remotely as a result of the pandemic, I think, will be one of them. But I also think working remotely will be a trend that will be greatly accelerated as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. If you think about it from an employee standpoint, yeah, you got to deal with the kids and all of that and learn a new rhythm of life, but you get to be at home. You don't have the commute. You don't have the drive. You don't have all the wasted time in coffee, water coolers and all that other stuff. It can be efficient. As someone who works mainly from home, I believe it can. It was an adjustment. But if you look at it from the employer's perspective, they have less resources that they have to dedicate to having a huge office and all the furniture and all the supplies and so forth. They can have smaller footprints in one of their major expenses, which is office space and supplies and things like that. So there's some benefits on the company side. So the question is, initially, okay, if this is a preference of workers, let's say you, assuming you're still working, what does this make possible for you? Well, it makes possible having what at least our listeners consistently say in our surveys of gaining more time freedom. Usually, it's almost overwhelming when we ask. People really want time freedom and control over their schedule more than they want not working or retirement. So this could give you more time freedom. And what does that make possible? That could extend your working life. Whereas if you had an hour and a half commute and you got to be in an office and wear a suit and spend the money on the clothes and all the meetings and everything else, you may want out of there early. But if you could have the meetings at home, you don't have the commute, you don't have to buy the suits and dress up all fancy every day, you may be willing to do that for a couple more years because you have the ability to live at home and have a little bit more time freedom. That can be a powerful lever for you in your working life. Obviously, all jobs don't lend themselves to this, but a lot do. What else could this make possible? Well, let's think through this. If companies give remote work as an option and you show that you're productive, my feeling is that will increase the long-term possibility of working half-time, a third time, or even longer. So not only can you extend your working life, companies by design, by seeing that you're productive remotely, they may be more open to the idea of you working part-time and not being in the corporate flow, but just being a provider because they want your wisdom and they know you can be productive from home. So maybe they'll be more amenable to you working half-time. then you really get the best of both worlds. This may not be the panacea for you, but I think this trend, it's obvious employees, according to this IBM study, they want the option. And we're getting a real life test of this right now. How productive can we be with a remote workforce? Anecdotally, the people that I talk to in management, they're in different companies, they're liking it a little bit. They're seeing that it can be productive. So I think this is actually really exciting news, whether you're getting ready to retire or whether you're 10 years out. So then the next question, if it makes all those things possible and those are attractive to you, maybe you don't have to reinvent yourself in pre-retirement. Maybe you can gain more life freedom earlier and get paid better because you're working at the same company. Now, if that's the case, what strategies do you have to facilitate this happening? Because who cares what the survey wants? If workers want to work at home and employers aren't willing, pandemic over, you're going back to work. And this is the perfect time to think about that because we're starting to open up the country. I was just talking with someone at a corporation who they were working out of the house and they were saying next Monday they're going back to work in the office. And they were sort of excited about it, but they had already gotten into a rhythm of being productive and being able to go downstairs and have dinner or walk the dog or have the kids and still be productive. So they were a little sad about it too. So the question for you is, and I think we posed this before, what strategies do you have to make this so in your world? I think the first thing, and the article poses some of these questions, is I think it's your responsibility as the worker to help answer some of the questions that the employer is going to have. And I think those questions are, how do you help them gain confidence that they can have some accountability for the work that you're going to be doing? Because there's a perception if you come into the office and you walk into your office that you are there working and you're on their time. Doesn't matter whether you're sleeping or playing solitaire, it's the perception. Johnny's down the office. I know he's there and he came in at 7 a.m. today. Golly, Johnny's a hard worker. Johnny could be playing solitaire. So how do you help them gain confidence so they can have some accountability for your actions? Because that's going to be a barrier on the employer end. If they're remote, how do I know what they're doing? Second question that they're going to have, and this was posed in the article, how do you measure productivity? How do I know Johnny is being productive? You're going to have them have clearer matrix to see the value that you're adding to the company. The question they're going to have is, well, what tools do they need? They're having to figure that out on the fly. And they're also having to figure out, how do I know it's safe? How do I know that the communication's safe and everything is, all those corporate secrets are secret? You need to have strategies to consider answering these questions for the employer. And luckily, because of this unexpected test run, a lot of these things are getting flushed out already. One reason this article is written, no doubt. And so it's up to you, if you want to try to work remotely, now is the time to be productive and create frameworks for accountability and demonstrate that, hey, I can do this remotely and be as productive or even more productive. And I can demonstrate this to you, whether it's with facts and figures or whatever matrix you come up with. It's our responsibility as a worker to help them answer that question because we want to decrease those barriers. I think of my business. So I don't even know now, I have 6 people working for me. We're all remote. And we've always been remote. And when I walked that journey, I had to figure out, well, how do I know what they're doing? How do I know what Nicole's doing in her house, working remotely for me, or Tracy, or Brandy, or others? I had to create a framework and hire differently because I had to hire people that I didn't have to micromanage. I didn't have to worry about the accountability because I knew that they just were wired to want to be productive. And I had to have them buy into what we're trying to accomplish here and really helping people rock retirement. They care about that mission. And because they care, I know we're all rowing the same direction. From a productivity standpoint, as an employer, we had to set up, we have regular huddles, we have weekly huddles where we are reviewing, this is where we are this week, this is what we're working on, this is where we're stuck, and here are the things that we're going to do between now and our next huddle. And we do that individually by person. In my view as the employer, and I'm not necessarily normal in many ways, but in my view as an employer, if it's clear what the expectations are. And I know that they care about the mission and they're working in the right direction. As long as the job gets done, I don't care if they're walking the dog, playing with the kids, or doing whatever, as long as we're doing the things we're supposed to be doing. I think this is exciting, personally. So I'll have a link to the article in 6-Shot Saturday. That's our weekly email that comes out Saturday mornings. It gives you a summary of the show and helpful links and thoughts that we have. If you're not signed up for 6-Shot Saturday, you can go to rogerwhitney.com and there's a place there to sign up for it. And we'll send you and you'll have the link to the article. But I think this is pretty exciting stuff. With that, let's go talk about your cost and spending assumptions in retirement. So in today's episode, we're going to talk about spending assumptions in retirement. And there's a lot of different ways to look at this, and it can be more nuanced than you realized. Now, as a side thought and a little bit of a plug, in the Rock Retirement Club, we just recently released, I think we're about to release, Module 5, which is an entire masterclass on creating your spending model, of figuring out how much you're going to spend in retirement and putting those numbers into a framework so you can start planning on whether you can afford it or not and find out where the levers are. So this is what we do in the club. We'll be talking and noodling on these questions as a club, but we also are releasing the masterclass that will help people figure out the answers for themselves. You can check that out at rockretirementclub.com. Assumptions are everything in long-term planning, and it's something we don't pay enough attention to. Today, we're going to talk about 2 critical assumptions. They may be the most critical assumptions that you make. One, you have a lot of control over, for the most part, and that is spending. The second one, you don't have a lot of control over, and that's inflation. So if you think about the task before you, let's say you're 60 years old, and you are planning for 10, 20, 30, 40 years of retirement life, and you're trying to make decisions today. Can I retire or not? How much can I spend early in retirement? Do I need to save more? How much investment risk do I need to take? A lot of those are going to come down to how you manage these 2 assumptions. So let's start with spending. So like the rule of thumb in withdrawal rates, the 4% rule, there is a rule of thumb of how much you'll likely spend in retirement. And it goes something like this. If you make $100,000 a year in retirement, you can expect to have to spend between 70 to 80% of what your income was. In fact, Fidelity Financial Solutions in 2019 came out with a study and they broke that down a little bit. They said if you make $50,000 or less during your working years, you're likely going to spend about 80% of that during retirement. But as your income goes up, the percentage of your income that you'll have to spend in retirement actually goes down. So they have it mapped out, and we share this all in the masterclass in the Rock Retirement Club. But for example, if you make more than $120,000 during your working years, they say you're likely going to spend 55 to 65% of that in retirement. Anecdotally, in the club, we're having discussions about this, and it tends to seem to work out this way. And some of the logic of why the replacement ratio goes down is if you're making $50,000 a year, most of that is being accounted for with pretty non-discretionary things, right? You have your rent or your mortgage, you have utilities, groceries, fuel, things that you can't really dial up and down. They're just sort of what you need. You have less discretionary budget to play around with. Whereas if you're making more than $120,000, at least how Fidelity breaks it down, and it even goes up from there, you have a lot more of the discretionary things in your budget, plus you're saving a lot more. So you may make $300,000 a year, but your savings rate is probably pretty high, and you're not going to be saving in retirement, so it makes sense that the replacement ratio would go down. So that rule of thumb, I think, is a good place to start. But ultimately, we have to get down to who you are. And this is from CEX data in 2017. And when we look at household spending by age group, these are averages now. If you're under 55, it's about $57,000 a year. If you're age 55 to 64, it actually goes up a little bit. It's about $59,000 a year. From 65 to 74, it starts to really go down at $47,000 a year of annual spending by age group. And if you're over 75, it really goes down. Your average household spending is about $37,000. Those are just averages from CEX data on normal household spending. So as you get older, it really starts to go down as you get towards that park bench of life. And this is part of the problem with assumptions, is we're going to use macro data. And you may have heard these numbers. Let's say you're 60 and you hear a 55 to 64-year-old spends on average $59,000. You might be saying, I don't spend that much and I'm happy as a clam. But someone else might be saying, what? How could you only spend that? My base needs are $150,000 or $200,000 a year. This is just an average, and it accounts for everybody on all ends of the spectrum. That's part of the problem with statistics in general, which we're going to get into in the last segment of this series at the end of the month. This average really doesn't mean anything to you because it's not you. So we got to be careful in using averages, and we'll see that with inflation as well. So if we look at average expenditures, and this comes from the Consumer Expenditure Survey 2018, it breaks it down even more by how much an age group spends on, say, shelter or food at home. So let's take groceries as an example. In their category, they say the average is if you're 55 to 64, you're spending about $4,700 a year on groceries. And then that starts to go down after 65. And then at 75 years plus, it's about $36,000. Well, that may make total sense. Yours may go down, but your numbers as far as the average is probably well off of what this is. We take that $4,700 a month if you're 55 to 64. That's spending about $400 a month on groceries. That may be totally realistic to you. That may be what you spend in a week. Everybody is going to classify all of these things very differently. And so we can start with these replacement ratios and looking at the averages, but we're going to have to take it a lot deeper, and we'll give you some tips at the end of this. Now let's talk about healthcare. Healthcare is a big one. Again, if we look at CEX data, 2017, estimated average annual healthcare expense per person. So if you're under 55, it's about $3,500 a year. If you're 55 to 64, it's about $5,300 a year. And it actually starts to go up as you get a little older. If we were to look at Medicare right now, and this is the data I use from Millman in some of my planning software, you're likely looking all in Medicare for Part A, well, A is free, but B, D, Medigap, and out of pocket, about $4,400, $4,500 per year per person once you hit Medicare. Those are the numbers that we use. But what about prior to Medicare? For an individual, we're looking at $10,000 to $15,000 a year. And a lot of this is going to be dependent upon your income sources, because let's just take Medicare. Those numbers go up if you have a modified adjusted gross income in retirement that goes up. If you're married and you have income over $170,000, your Medigap is going to go up, and it could almost double depending on how much you have in modified adjusted gross income during retirement. But I think those are good base estimates, and there are a lot of data sources that you can start to use as a rule of thumb. And some of this has to do, it's okay to use rule of thumb or generalized data the farther away you are from the decision date. And we'll talk about this in our action steps. But as you get closer to, in this case, retirement, the less you want to use rule of thumb and the more you want to use your data based on your life. And I think that's really important. So with healthcare as an example, we can throw out, let's use $10,000 to $15,000 for healthcare before Medicare per person. We can throw that out when we're 5-6 years plus, but as we get closer, we're going to want to really dial that in and maybe go get actual quotes and look at our healthcare spending, because some people will have huge out of pocket. Other people don't use healthcare that much. So that's when you really want to start to dial that in. So when we talk about your spending assumptions, we want to factor in some of the things we talked about last week. We want to talk about, obviously, the customization, but everybody is going to have different categories. And I generally use needs, wants, and wishes. So I define every subcategory within one of those larger categories. So the needs category, we want to dial in. That's going to include discretionary or non-discretionary spending, groceries, utilities, housing, etc., healthcare. But we also want to factor in the base life of eating out once in a while, taking a small trip once in a while. I don't think the needs category needs to be rice and beans. It needs to be your firewall of this is what represents a good life. Enough covering the non-discretionary and giving me a little bit of discretionary to go enjoy my hobby or what have you. And in the course where we teach people how to map this out and give them spreadsheets to do it, one thing we talk about is what is need for one person is discretionary for another person. So as an example, certain people would include a country club membership in their need category. You might be saying, that seems silly. That's extravagant. On the surface, it may appear that way, and I've dealt with this. But for some people, that country club represents their entire social ecosystem. It gives them the hobby of golf, exercise, dining, friends, purpose, if they serve and they volunteer. It's their entire social structure. So for somebody that has had that, and that is where their social structure is, it's a need. And I've dealt with thinking through this with country club memberships, especially if you think of a single spouse, a widower or a widow, where that was there to begin with, and then one spouse passes, it can become even more critical. In the case I'm thinking of, that was the case. Where, yeah, if you blew this up and you got rid of the country club, you lose your entire social network and your ecosystem for how you live your life. Now, not that you couldn't recreate it, but it would be a long journey that you may not want to be on in your mid 60s or 70s. So other people, it might be the yacht club. Pick your poison of what it might be. But the point is that you're going to want to define this needs category for yourself. Obviously, all the non-discretionary stuff, just living and being alive, but also some of the discretionary stuff that are really important components to your life. Because that needs category will represent the most important firewall from a planning standpoint that we have to make sure is covered. And then the next category is the wants category. That's going to be the extra travel, the extra stuff that you can dial up and down as your life unfolds, where you have flexibility. And then obviously the next category is the aspirational or the wish category. Each one of these categories are important to establish for yourself, because in practice, what you're going to do is make decisions on how you dial up or down your lifestyle based on how life is unfolding. And when you go through a pandemic or a great recession like in 2008, it's very useful to have these firewalls of spending pre-defined. So if we get stress, we know where we can cut down, and we know what is the most important firewall to protect, which is that needs category. So it's really, in my mind, very important that you know these different categories. And in your planning, you're looking at what's our confidence in doing all of them. Usually the wish category is, maybe. The want category is likely. And then the needs category is, heck yes, that one's totally feasible. It's good to know that, and you won't know that unless you categorize this way. It's going to be very helpful as you walk this journey. And then the second part of your spending assumptions, and we touched on this last week from the life perspective, is this idea of seasons of go, slow go, no go. When we're sitting here at 60 years old, we're making assumptions about our life as a 60-year-old, because that's who you are. Everything else is theoretical, except for who you are and how you think about yourself. We do it unconsciously. We just extrapolate that we are who we are, and this is always who we are, so that's how I make decisions. And then intellectually we'll know, oh yeah, I may slow down when I'm 80, but we don't really give it as much value as it deserves. So as an example, let's assume you're a 60-year-old and you determine that the income that you're going to need is $125,000 a year. And so you make that spending assumption. Well, all calculators that are available, how much would you plan on spending in retirement? You plug in your $125,000 a year, you put all the other things, and it tells you results based on its analysis of whether you can do this or not, etc. And let's assume you say you're going to live until 95. Well, the calculator doesn't think of you as a 90-year-old being any different than you are today. You told it that you want to spend $125,000 a year. And then you're going to throw in some inflation rate. And we're going to talk about that here in a second. And so it's just going to run the numbers and tell you whether it's possible or not. But in the background, what happens, that $125,000 that you say you need to spend as your 60-year-old self, well, it's going to assume that you're spending that at age 90, inflation adjusted, which works out to a little over $300,000 a year, because that spending assumption you make is going to compound year after year after year after year, when in reality, you're not going to spend that way. You're going to potentially want to spend more than $125,000 a year if that's your base, because you're young and you have energy and you want to go do things. So maybe you say, actually, it's going to be $150,000 a year. And so you put that in there, not realizing that it's assuming in the background that you're going to be spending that inflation adjusted even when you're 85 or 95. And because of the compounding, the power of compounding, it's going to potentially drastically overestimate how much you're actually going to spend in retirement. Because in reality, at least in my reality of working with clients, people won't spend that way. What they're going to do is they're going to want to spend a lot more in their 60s, maybe even into their 70s, but then they're going to slow down. They're either going to slow down their travel, they're going to slow down their activities, or even downsize their house and their assets to live a simpler life without as much upkeep. And so your assumption, we want to try to have seasons in your assumption if it makes sense, because by just acknowledging I'm not going to spend like a 60-year-old when I'm a 90-year-old, just like you're not going to party like a 20-year-old when you're a 50-year-old. And by making a more nuanced assumption, it can literally buy you more life now. What do I mean by that? Well, if we don't have this drastic overestimation of spending, and we use these seasons of go, slow go, no go, it puts less stress financially on your resources, which may allow you to retire earlier, save less now, take less investment risk, or spend more during your go-go years. So this is a really important assumption. And so you want to have a spreadsheet or a tool that helps you do that. In the masterclass in the Rock Retirement Club, when we teach this course, we have a spreadsheet that helps you make those assumptions, but you can build one yourself as well. So that's the other area I wanted to make sure I talked about on spending assumptions. Now let's go to inflation. Okay, you can't see it, but I'm conducting my hands like a conductor. Everybody say it together now. What is the inflation rate we use? And everybody will say in unison, 3%. That's the normal inflation rate people use. Is it accurate? I don't know. Let's talk about inflation. So since 1926, from 1926 to 2019, the average inflation rate was 2.86%. I'll call it 3%. Round it up, call it 3%. That average is okay. But in the last segment of this month, we'll talk about averages and statistics. But let's look at that 2.86% average. That's almost 100 years. So the last 20 years, the inflation rate has been 2.07. The last 10 years, it's been 1.63%. So this average, just like market averages, doesn't tell you much. That's the problem with long-term averages, because we have different seasons of life. In the 70s, what was inflation? It averaged 7.36%, but it got up into the teens, didn't it? In the 80s, inflation was 5.10%. Averages by decade get a little bit different. In fact, we think of the 70s as hyperinflation, right? We had inflation rate in the teens, which seems unimaginable now. We had interest rates on mortgages at 10, 15% a year. Holy cow. It's hard to even imagine now. But did you know back in World War II was actually when we had the highest inflation, it was almost 20% in 1 year. But in general, inflation has bounced around the 2 to 4%. So that means we probably use, say, 3%. Maybe that's fairly valid. But we have to consider that we don't know what inflation will be. Let's take that fictitious 60-year-old again. We'll call that you. What inflation will be over the next 10 years? Are we going to get a 70s experience of 7.36%? Or are we going to get the last 10 years, which is 1.63%? That's a huge difference. And depending on the assumption you make, it will drastically change your planning. So you can imagine if you're a 70 or 60-year-old in 1979 and you were doing retirement planning, which wasn't even really a thing then, by the way. That's how new all of this is. And you're sitting there and trying to thoughtfully make assumptions about spending and inflation. What inflation rate would you use if you were doing your planning in 1979? The long-term average was probably still bouncing around 3%, but in 79, the mindset was probably, this hyperinflation is here to stay. I'm going to have to use 8%. You're going to, have a bias towards using a high number because that's been your experience. Most people aren't biased to using a low number, but it can really impact, again, we talked about spending over a long period of time. The inflation rate you use will impact a lot of the numbers that come out. And inflation is one of those tricky things, right? We know what market volatility is. You and I, we got that t-shirt. Inflation, we think back, I guess my wife and I were doing this the other day. Our first house we bought in 92, and I think we bought it at $93,000. And it's more than doubled in value. It wasn't that great a house, but that's inflation. It's one of those things you look back on. It's like, oh yeah, remember when this cost that? Gas was, a nickel. It's not something you notice front and center like a bear market. So this is one reason why, we think of inflation and market returns, which we'll talk about next week in terms of assumptions. Those are two big risks in retirement. They're like opposite ends of a teeter-totter, and we're standing on the middle trying to balance those two. It's very easy to deal with the pain right now and not take market risk, which inherently will give us a lot more inflation risk over time because it's one of those insidious things that we have a hard time of conceptualizing. So what do you use as an assumption? I use a flat rate. We use around 2.86%. Do I think that's accurate? I do not. Do I know it's accurate? I do not. We'll get to this with market returns as well. So with inflation, you have the question, do I use the data, knowing that it's not perfect and it's not accurate, or do I make a forecast? By using the data, you're essentially making a forecast, just using historical data. And some people, especially now that I saw the chart the other day, it was amazing, of the Fed balance sheet of printing money and getting money out there. The Fed balance sheet, because of the pandemic, has just gone through literally the roof. And you compare it to what happened in 2008, this dwarfs that in terms of the amount of Fed spending and the debt and everything else, which long-term can be inflationary in theory. So there are a lot of people seeing what's happening. We're printing money like it's funny money. Kind of is sometimes. We're going to have hyperinflation. This cannot work long-term, which may in fact be true. But when we say long-term, we don't know what long-term actually is. Long-term can be a lot longer term than you think it can be. And timing is everything when you're making predictions about the future. So when you're making your inflation assumption, you can use the data. Or you can do what a lot of people on Wall Street do, even with markets, is based on this, that, and the other thing, this blah, 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 we are going to forecast what inflation will be or market returns will be into the future. And it will sound very, very smart. The problem is they don't know squat because it's the future and we don't know timing. And so the question you'll have to ask yourself when you're making an inflation assumption is it worth my effort to use a forecasted expectation? Am I gaining enough value in using a forecast that will materially impact my planning? Most of the time, the answer is no. And this is one reason why you need to be agile, is because rather than spending time trying to find the great forecaster that you have confidence in, it's better spent creating systems so you can monitor and adjust as life unfolds. And that's the approach that I prefer, because I would rather stop trying to guess what's going to happen, whether it's inflation or markets, and spend time adjusting as life unfolds. If inflation starts to spike, well, as you're iterating and making constant adjustments to your model, you'll be able to pick that up and make little changes or adjustments to your forecasting, taking in the new information. I've spent 25 plus years doing this. I've gone down the road of looking at the smartest people, trying to find the person who I believe in from an intellectual standpoint that I feel has some ability to do this, and I have never seen it work. Even if they're right, in theory, something happens that is unexpected because this is such a multidimensional issue to begin with that changes the dynamics of their original thesis, or they were right, but their timing was 10, 15 years off, so it didn't help me anyway. So I just used the data. So now let's talk about healthcare assumptions. So first, let's talk about Medicare. Historically, since 1966, Medicare premiums have gone up about 7.7% a year. That's significant. Healthcare expenditures are huge. Now, one thing that we don't talk about a lot when we're talking about Medicare inflation assumption is there's something called the hold harmless clause, which says if you are receiving Social Security and enrolled in Medicare, the hold harmless clause prevents your Part B premiums from rising faster than the inflation adjustment to Social Security. So if you have Social Security payments go up by, say, 2% next year, and the published Medicare Part B premiums go up by 10%, if you're already receiving Social Security, you're only going to see an increase of the 2% because of the hold harmless clause. So where this will impact you, these huge increases, if you're not taking Social Security yet. Until you take Social Security, this hold harmless clause. So all the big increases that we see are for future enrollees. Once you enroll, as the current scheme is structured, Part B is not able to increase more than your Social Security would increase. So we want to factor that in. And I think using a standard rate, maybe a little bit higher for Social Security, for right around the 3% range, I think is acceptable. But just realize that we worry about healthcare inflation. Now, this doesn't necessarily impact the out-of-pocket. I definitely think Medigap insurance is critical to control some of that risk. Now, when we're talking about healthcare before Medicare, what assumption do you make? Well, I think you could use the 6 or 7% on your premiums. Honestly, we don't know what it is because this system is so in flux and so messed up and supposedly going to be fixed at some point that I don't know what to use. So we just use a standard rate. The last part of the inflation rate I want to talk about is your personal inflation rate. And this is something I don't know what you do with it, but it's something to be aware of. The more non-discretionary category makes of your overall retirement budget, the less you're going to have a more personal inflation rate, the less wiggle there's going to be in there. But the higher income and the more affluent you are, the more in terms of assets and income sources, the more your personal inflation rate comes into play because the non-discretionary stuff takes such a smaller percentage. And so what do I mean by that? Well, I have clients when they travel to Europe that are affluent that spend as a couple $8,000 for a week. I have clients that travel to Europe as a couple that are affluent that will spend $30,000. There's a lot of choice in there. I'm amazed when I look at balance sheets and income sources in retirement. One person's travel to Europe is very different than another person's travel to Europe. My clients tend to be fairly frugal. That's not necessarily a value thing. It's just they're fairly frugal. They have trouble spending money. It's just an incline. But I have other clients that are very opposite, and they're going to have a different inflation rate. They're not going to look for deals. They're not going to look for swap opportunities. Whereas my more normal client, the frugal clients, they will. So we have a personal inflation rate that is going to apply to us. But I think these are two very critical assumptions for you because they're big inputs into whatever kind of model you're using. So the more nuanced you can be in creating them, the better. Okay, so now let's get to what do we do with all of this? So how do you define your spending rate? Let's focus on that one, on something proactive you can do right now. So if you're 4 or 5 years from retirement and you're busy and you don't want to make this a huge project for yourself, you can do what's called a top-down estimate. So a top-down estimate is fairly quick and dirty. And we teach this in the course in the Rock Retirement Club, rockretirementclub.com, where basically you're going to look at all of your income sources, W-2s and so forth. You're going to take all of your income sources. You're going to subtract all of your savings. And that's going to give you a top-down estimate of what you spend right now. If you don't want to do budgeting and you're not sure what you're spending, just take all of your income sources, subtract all of your savings sources, and that's going to give you a number that's in the ballpark of what you spend right now. And then if you want to take one extra step, you can make adjustments for what spending that you know is going to go away, the tuition, et cetera. And then what spending you know is going to come back in, healthcare before Medicare. And that's going to give you a good ballpark of what you're spending right now. If you're far away from retirement, that's probably good enough. As you get closer to retirement, though, you're going to want to go from top down to bottom up and really start to dial that in. So bottom up is literally starting with a blank page and going through the data of what do you spend by category. And it means you're going to have all the data, whether it's bank statements. There's a lot of tools now that will help you do this, Quicken, and you need a budget and things like that. But you're going to want to do a bottom up so you can really get a handle on each category. The hard part with bottom up, and it seems like it would be the most accurate, and most often it is, it's easy to miss things. And it takes a lot of work. And some people love it. They've done it all their lives and they just geek out on their budgets. Other people don't. But I think as you get closer to retirement, let's call that 2 to 3 years or closer, you're going to want to do top down and you're going to want to do bottom up. I think you want to do both. And you want to create a first year model retirement budget by category, meaning all the individual things, and also by needs, wants, and wishes, because there will be other spending that you may want to bring in there. So if you're over 3 years out and you're super busy, do the top down estimate. And if you're really dialed in, you can do the bottom up. And then once you do that model 1 year retirement budget, then you can start to build the model going out in year 2 of retirement, year 3 of retirement. And that's where you can start to factor in extra travel for seasons, all the optionality of when things might hit over your 30-year timeline. In the master course, we teach this and we give a spreadsheet and show you examples so you can go build it using the spreadsheet. But I think that's something that you want to do because you want to model those go-go years, those slow-go years. You're going to want to model those one-off anniversary trips or gifts to children and so forth. So those are 2 approaches to start to dial in your spending. The third is in those 2 to 3 years prior to retirement, if you've created a model retirement budget for the first year, use it. Test run it while you're working. Live on that budget. And that will give you a better intuitive feel as to whether it's right for you. So with that, let's go get to your questions with Nicole. All right, we're going to get to some questions and answers. And to do that, we need to bring on the best mom in the whole world. Your boys told me to say that, by the way. For Mother's Day, Nicole Mills. How are you, Nicole?
I'm hanging in there. How about you?
You're going to be mother times 1, 2, 3 pretty soon.
I will. I will. I'm ready though. I'm getting to that uncomfortable, like this baby is big and I'm awkward and it's time to go kind of feeling.
I remember when my wife was pregnant with our kids and we got to the 3rd trimester and that's like, okay, I'm ready.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm like,
yes.
And I would say, honey, it's all part of the miracle. That didn't
It's easy for you to say because you're not the one lugging the extra weight around your middle. She
essentially said that with very colorful words that we will not share here. But we have questions, correct?
We do. We've got some questions from Gray on asset dedication. He wants to know, what are your thoughts on the concept of asset dedication? And he specifically is referring to Huxley and Burns. And then he wants to know, can you provide retirement planning services?
Yeah, so asset dedication and the paper by Huxley and Burns essentially is talking about asset liability matching or pie cake building to an extent. And it takes an examination of modern portfolio theory, which is asset allocation, which is what the standard practice of the industry has been for over a quarter of a decade, and challenging its assumptions when it comes to withdrawal strategies. Because essentially what's happened, Nicole, is in Gray, is that as people have aged, the baby boomers have aged, and asset allocation, which is a good concept for growing your wealth, isn't really designed for withdrawal strategies, meaning paying yourself in retirement. And what they've done is try to shoehorn these ideas of safe withdrawal rates from your asset allocation, the 4% rule, into a framework that was never really meant for withdrawal strategies. And so what asset dedication is an argument of, hey, modern portfolio theory, this asset allocation isn't meant for retirement. Really, when you're in the withdrawal stage of life, we need something new, a new framework. And asset dedication is simply, we know we have these streams of income that we have to pay ourselves year by year in retirement, the IOMEs, I call them. And so we need to rethink how bonds are. If we know we need $100,000 a year for 10 years, let's dedicate some assets to provide the $100,000 a year for 10 years. And in their paper, they talk about building bond ladders with individual bonds. So there's no market risk, there's just default risk. And that way the money comes due when the IOME, when you need the money, and then dedicating the rest of your assets to growth assets, mainly equities, with the idea of allowing those the time to statistically do well and to help rebuild your capital by the time you burn through your bond ladder. And at modern portfolio theory and asset allocation never even thinks of it that way. They just think of bonds. They don't distinguish between bond funds, individual bonds. It's more optimizing returns for a given level of risk without even considering cash flow. So Gray, I like the concept of asset dedication. Really, it's a take on asset liability matching, which is something that pensions funds do. And this is exactly what we're teaching in Rock Retirement University within the club. And this is essentially what the pie cake is. It's our version of it. So they're building on something that I think is really critical to be successful in retirement. Now, in terms of do we provide retirement services? We do. You can go to agileretirementmanagement.com and go to work with us. We do not work on a flat fee or an hourly basis. Just be aware of that because we walk life with clients, but you can check that out there.
All right. Our next, well, it's a comment, not a question, is from Carol. And she wrote in, Roger, I have learned so much from your podcast and I'm a big listener. I wanted to point out that I think something we personally discovered about IRMAA isn't clear and is possibly stated incorrectly on the podcast on IRMAA. You refer several times to the fact that IRMAA looks back 2 years and that a big IRA withdrawal or high income in those years could come back to haunt you. However, if the current year your income is below that threshold, then it's just a matter of filling out a simple form with evidence that your current income is below the threshold, and they'll adjust it to eliminate the IRMAA extra cost. We've done this twice, and it was as simple as providing a letter stating that my husband had retired and no longer had that higher income. So perhaps if someone wants to put in the patio the year or two before they go on Medicare, it would be a good idea to do it then. Just a thought. Thanks for all you do.
Carol, thank you so much for pointing that out. Get into the weeds so much, sometimes we can just misspeak. So what she's referring to is that IRMAA is the surcharge on Medicare Part B and Part D potentially, and it can come into play and it can be pretty significant if you earn too much money because they're looking at income. And sometimes we have life-changing events that, and this is what Carol is referring to, that cause a reduction in income. Say you earned $100,000 a year and then you just retired, like she had mentioned. Well, if that happens and you have this life-changing reduction, you can request an exemption by filing Form SSA 44. And that will basically say, hey, to the IRS, hey, got this big change going on. And that is an easy way, and you've done it successfully. So good to you, and thank you for pointing that out. That's why I wanted to include it here, because it's really important.
Our next question is from Teresa on RMDs for 2020. She says, unfortunately, I already took my 2020 RMDs from my inherited traditional and Roth IRAs. The money is relatively small, but I'd love to put the traditional IRA back and not be taxed on it this year. Is there any hope I could do that? Thanks for your excellent podcasts, Roger.
Hey, Teresa. Well, I'm very glad that you like the show. Okay, let's talk about required minimum distributions in 2020, because we have all these acts flying around. the CARES Act, stimulus packages, all related to the pandemic. And one of them allows us to not have to take a required minimum distribution in 2020. And there are two people that are required to take RMDs. Someone over the age of 70, if you've already been doing it, or 72, and someone that has inherited an IRA. And it sounds like you're in this boat. Because if you inherit an IRA, whether it's a Roth or a traditional, you have to take required minimum distributions over your lifetime. So let's start with regular IRAs and required minimum distributions. If you haven't taken your distribution, you're good. You don't have to take it for 2020. You get a pass for this year. But some people usually take it the beginning of the year or near the beginning of the year. So now they've already taken the distribution, but now you don't have to. What do they do? Well, technically, what the rule change allows is that required minimum distribution now becomes what they call an eligible rollover distribution, meaning that if you take the money out, you have 60 days to put it back into your IRA. So if you've taken your required minimum distribution, now they change the rules. If you're within the 60-day window, you can put it back into your IRA and everything's cool. Now, what if it's outside the 60-day window? We don't have any guidance on that. I'm not sure. You know, the IRS may say, well, if you've been infected by the COVID virus and the pandemic, that you may be able to put it back in, but we really don't know. One thing we do know, though, is that there's a rule when there's rollover. If you take money out of an IRA, you have 60 days to put it back in with no penalty, but you're only allowed to do that once in a 12-month period. So that 12-month rule still applies. So if you took a distribution from an IRA, put it back in an IRA anytime in the last 12 months, you may not be able to put the RMD back because that 12-month rule. And now if you do put it back, you have that 12-month rule going 12 months going forward. Thank you, IRS. This is all very simple. So, Teresa, what about you and this inherited IRA? Because that's really what you care about. Well, if you hadn't taken the distribution, you can skip it. But if you took the distribution, that's generally not eligible for rollover in any instance. So it's not an eligible rollover distribution. So you really can't put it back in. The IRS hasn't given us any guidance on this exemption that they put in with taking the RMD. So until they give us some guidance, you really can't put it back into your inherited IRA. Now, it's possible if you were affected by the coronavirus in some related distribution because you needed the money or something like that, you may be able to put it back in. But again, we need guidance from the IRS and we're waiting. So as of now, you can't. Do you still like the show? Well, let's go set a smart sprint, Miss Nicole Mills.
On your marks, get set.
And we're off to set a little baby step that we can do from our house, hopefully, over the next 7 days to move forward in rocking retirement. So in the next 7 days, we need to revisit our cost assumptions in retirement. If you're part of the Rock Retirement Club, we're just getting ready to release the module where we help you think through these assumptions and we give you a Google spreadsheet to categorize them so we can be intelligent about these assumptions. If you are not, this is the time to look at the assumptions you're making to make sure that they're not accurate because they'll never be accurate, but more thoughtful because they can have a big impact on your life. Nicole, I have a clock ticking down.
Do you? What are you counting
T
down?
minus when Nicole is not working with me every day for 2 months.
Am I going to have to call and check on you, make sure you're doing okay?
I don't want you to do that because you'd feel bad. I wouldn't want you to do that because I know you'll miss being in the mix.
I will miss it. I will.
But you're doing it for very good reasons for yourself and for the new little guy. And
yes, and I'm kind of excited. Summer baby, and the boys won't have to get up and go to school in the morning. We'll just hopefully be able to take it a little slower.
Yeah, those first 2 months
online school like we've been doing.
Boo online school.
Yes, boo online school.
At least but they don't have it figured out. So we got to give them that.
Yes.
Right. They just don't have it figured out. So I hope all of us have an amazing summer. I'm very optimistic. I'm excited.
Me too.
Yeah. So I hope you have an amazing summer. And next week on the show, we are talking about retirement assumptions when it comes to markets and inflation. Have a great day. Hey, Hey, it's time for that all-important disclaimer. We so appreciate you listening to the show and love your questions and love the teaching that we're able to provide here. And actually, it helps us too. But remember, you're not our clients.
Not love it if you took advice from us on the show.
We would not love it if you took advice from us on the show. Realize this is helpful in education. Talk to your legal advisor, your tax advisor, or your financial advisor before you make any decisions.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of Retirement Answer Man. Be sure to visit rogerwhitney.com/answers to access the Retirement Answer Library with over 30 checklists to help you make the most of the only life you have. Remember, you have more power than you realize to create an amazing life starting today with Retirement Answer Man. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Have a wonderful day.